All right, as promised, this week we're going to start on the courts, uh, specifically the criminal courts. But to understand the difference, we are going to first start off with defining the criminal versus civil courtroom, and then we're going to probably do over two videos talk about the different actors that are in the courtroom and all their jobs and specifically what they do in the courtroom. So starting with what's the difference between criminal and civil court. We've already talked about criminal court as an issue of person versus society. The person has committed an act that has offended everyone, versus civil court, where it's somebody specific. The biggest differences between the two, other than in a criminal case it's called the prosecution, in a civil case it's called a plaintiff, and the steps that lead up to the actual time in the courtroom is the jury. In a criminal case, the jury has to decide unanimously in the state of Pennsylvania that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil court, it's a majority of the jury members, and the balance of evidence is we think one side made a better argument than the other. They are both held in the same courtrooms. They do have the same judges. Judge can oversee both criminal and civil cases, with the exception family court has its own, typically its own. But we will get into that as we go. Now, most cases are handled on a state level. I'm going to move me up here so you can see all this. That's, by the way, the federal building down in Philly. That's the federal courtroom in Philadelphia. That's, if you ever get federal jury duty, that's where you're going to go, Philadelphia. Obviously, if you get jury duty here, our local one is obviously Norristown. I know some of you will say, well, there's one in Collegeville. Yes, Judge Rebar's courtroom. She is in Collegeville. She's going to handle mostly cases, speeding tickets, stuff like that. Your not misdemeanors, but your summary offenses. She's going to handle most of that stuff. She might handle some DUIs, stuff like that. Most of your other cases, your misdemeanors or your felonies, are going to be handled down in Norristown. So if you ever get jury duty for jury duty for state court, that would be in Norristown. The term jurisdiction, that is who has the authority to hear the cases. And most of the cases that you ever read about are going to be handled by state courts. That's going to be a majority. And it's actually going to be on the lowest level, and you'll see that in the next slide, what I mean by the lowest level. Only the lowest level is what you typically see on TV. That's going to have your jurors. That's going to have your witnesses testifying. Appellate courts are actually only going to have the attorneys making their arguments to appellate judges, and they're actually not deciding the outcome of the case, but they're deciding a matter of law. What does that mean? Well, let's say in your lower courtroom, one of the most important pieces of evidence, the judge decides to exclude it because the police did not use a proper search warrant and the defendant is found to be not guilty. The prosecution may file an appeal there to the appellate court before the end of the trial, basically stating to the judge that the police had exigent circumstances. It was a dangerous situation. They didn't have time to get a warrant. It was exigent circumstances, in which case the appellate court may say, you are correct. The police did not need a warrant. There were exigent circumstances. Now we're going to go back to that lower courtroom, but now we're going to allow the evidence and see if the outcome ends differently. So an appellate court is very different than your normal, your lowest level of court, where you have the witnesses and you do have the jurors to help to decide the outcome of the case. Like I said, the only thing that the federal government is going to take right away are typically people, foreign nationals, maritime law, which is anything that happens on the water, things like bankruptcy, things like if it's a case between state versus state, something like that. So most of your cases that you typically read or hear about, your murders, your arsons, your bank robberies, stuff like that, are all going to happen at your local state level. Something like Bill Cosby, as big as it was, still was down in Norristown because was a state level. What happened, the original charge was in Cheltenham, so that's Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Our court system looks like this here in Pennsylvania. Like I said, if you look, you have a lot of the traffic courts. This is to keep a lot of a lot to keep the court system moving quickly. The other big difference between criminal and criminal cases usually happen between 9 and 12 months between the time of arrest and the time of the trial. Civil cases can be 8 and 10 years sometimes. The backlog for civil cases is much greater than it is for criminal courts. Like I said, the one you want to remember is the Court of Common Pleas. The Court of Common Pleas for here is Norristown, and that's where most of your cases are going to be heard in those two buildings in Norristown. And if you really want to be a law student, a good suggestion: take the summer, go and watch some of those courtrooms, see what happens in those courtrooms. You can. It's open, free to the public. It is public record, so you can go and sit and watch court cases in those courtrooms. Like I said, if you know Judge Rebar or went to school with her son, that's down here. That would be our magisterial district courts, and they're going to handle most of the smaller things. The top three, obviously, then are going to be our appellate courts, and those are the ones between, like I said earlier, the judge and the attorneys to make that argument. Once that is decided, then the case will go back to our Court of Common Pleas to continue and finish up. All of this is brought to you by, of course, go back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about the due process clause. Everybody has their right to their day in court. So even after, this is the third part, we talked about the laws, we talked about the police enforcing the laws. Now is our day in court. That's part of our due process. And everybody's entitled to that. Anything from a speeding ticket to murder is entitled to that day in court, a fair day in court. And we talked about this already. Remember, due process, proper law was carried out. We couldn't be a law after the fact, or we can't just make up laws as we go. That the proper police procedures were followed. There was no racial discrimination. There was no the police were actually pulling somebody over or stopping for a valid, lawful reason. They used a lawful search warrant, etc. And then finally, our day in court to make sure our due process, everybody's entitled to that due process, which they are, every person. All right, so let's start to take a look at the courtroom, what a courtroom looks like. Now, I told you that now the plaintiff, I used a civil case because it was a pretty good layout of the case. This would be the prosecution. Every courtroom can be different. It does not have to be exactly like this. I know most of the courtroom drama that you watch look like this. So there's a bunch of people involved. Obviously, the biggest one's prosecution, and the counsel's there, the defense attorney with the defendant, our jury box, our witness stand, our court reporter, our bailiff who enforces the laws. There's probably multiple bailiffs there. There's also something called the court crier to handle any issues. And then, of course, our judge. And then the spectators, this is called the gallery. If you're ever in the courtroom, even if you're watching, make sure everybody's under the judge's jurisdiction. So whatever the judge says goes. And so, like I said, we'll talk about that. We're going to start with the judge. Basically, the judge, think of the judge, this is a real courtroom. This is one of our mock trial teams a few years ago. She is a real judge. The judge is the interpreter of the law. And they decide how that law is going to be enforced in their courtroom. Please keep in mind that every courtroom can be treated differently. So some judges will be stricter on the laws, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the judge's philosophy, versus some that'll be a little bit looser on the laws. So it does matter sometimes which judge you're hearing your case in front of. They're all powerful in their courtroom, which means whatever they say goes. They are I always refer to them as the great and powerful Oz. So most, you don't want to go in there and have your phone be real flip in there, even if you're just a spectator, because the judge couldn't hold you. Remember the contempt of court charge or disrespect for the court charge, and that can come with a nice little fine. Could be a day in jail if the judge decides that. So what they say in that courtroom goes, how the evidence is interpreted, decision on the rules of law there, how people act appropriately. Everything that goes on in that courtroom is entirely up to the judge. And typically most of them don't have a great sense of humor, so don't go in there and be flip. Hopefully none of you will ever be defendants, but you don't want to go in there and go, oh yeah, judge. And one of the great stories that I never got a chance to tell you, one of the, police officers would come in and talk about all the time. People would come in and they dressed like they were going fishing after they went to court. That's not a great way to represent yourself. You want to go in there when you're in court, you want to wear a shirt and a tie or a dress, ladies, or a pantsuit, whatever it may be. You want to be very respectful of the court when you're in there, because the judges do take it personally. Unfortunately, we didn't get to watch My Cousin Vinny, but if you get a chance, watch it. It's usually on television. If not, rent it. You can get it a couple bucks at Walmart. The director of the movie is a lawyer. He has his Juris Doctorate, so it's very accurate to the portrayal of how a judge can act in a courtroom, being very, very formal. And they don't like when people are flip or inappropriate, or you go in there in your designer jeans with those little razzle dazzle things on the pants. You don't want to be doing that. They can decide the outcome in certain cases if it's what's called a bench trial, which means the judge is also the jury there. Typically, though, if it's a jury trial, they'll defer to the decision of the jury unless it's a matter of law, and we'll talk about that much later on, where the jury misinterprets the law entirely. So how do judges get selected? Well, federal judges are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. It's usually, unless it's the Supreme Court, most people really don't pay too much attention to that. Federal judges will serve a lifetime of service until they ever retire or they die. Typically, the president picks the judge basis. The biggest part is on judicial philosophy or the background of the judge, and we'll talk about philosophy here in a second, because that plays a very big part of what's in the courtroom. In the states, like Pennsylvania, which is, of course, what we have, where we're at, so we'll talk about that. They can be selected by the governor, very similar process, and approved by the Senate, like in the feds. But in the case of Pennsylvania, they are elected. PA judges are elected over a 10-year term. My personal opinion, I don't really care for that, because most of us don't know the judges. So typically people will vote just based on party line, which to me is not a great way to vote. Judges really don't, and as a judge, you really shouldn't try to go out and convince people to vote for you. I'm not for that either. So I'm not a big fan of voting for judges. I have gotten to know some, obviously being down in the courtroom, being with the mock trial team, and doing stuff like this. But unfortunately, that's limited. And most people that do know judges, unfortunately, were sitting in front of them and probably don't have high opinions in them anyway. So what about their views? I said that makes a huge difference in a courtroom. So what are the biggest views or the philosophies of the judge in the courtroom? Well, the first one is what's called I'm trying to find a good place so you guys can see everything. It's called the strict construction. So try to think of the most simple law there is, and that's 55. Cannot drive over 55. If you're driving 57, I know it sounds facetious, but if the police officer pulls you over, you are breaking the law. So, as a strict constructionist, they see the law exactly how it's written. So if you get a 57, you go stand before the judge, and you go, "But Your Honor, I was only doing 57. The judge could go, "What was the speed limit?" "What was 55? Is 57 more than 55? "Well, yes." "Okay, then you're breaking the law. You're guilty." Done. Pretty simple, cut and dry. Whatever the law is, that's how I'm reading it. That is a strict construction interpretation of the law. The other is what's called the loose construction. This is typically somebody who interprets the spirit of the law and not the exact wording. In this case, you go stand before a judge, you're doing 57 and a 55. The judge may look at the officer and say, "What was the speed limit?" "What was 55? Was this person weaving in and out of traffic?" "Well, no." Was this person driving dangerously? "Well, no." Were they driving with the flow of traffic? "Well, yes." "Well, then why are they in this courtroom?" "They weren't driving dangerously. Yes, they were breaking the speed limit, but they were driving safely within the flow of traffic. They weren't creating havoc out on the roads. Why would you bring this case? Why would you cite this person?" They may go the not guilty route or reduce your fine. Why? Because they're looking at the spirit. What does the law mean? So they're looking at a loose construction. They're reading into the law a little bit, maybe, but it's looking at the spirit of the law. What's the whole point of 55? Well, to keep people safe on the road. So this makes a big difference when you get into a case. Is the judge looking at the law specifically, or are they looking at the spirit of the law? What does the law mean? So judge plays a very important role in the outcome of the case. Next part, we'll look at the rest of the actors. Have a great day.